going on, folks? And here at Tool Dynaworks, I'm back with our 2024 Transalp, and this is just a quick update with where we're at with our custom ECU mapping for this bike, what we've developed for the slip-ons, what we've developed for the full systems, and why I quite haven't yet released it on our website while we work through one or two more bugs with the software developers before I can honestly say this thing is perfect. Now, just a quick recap for those of you here that didn't see the YouTube video we posted last week. This is how this bike performs stock. You can see the power just completely falls off after 8,500 RPMs, literally off a cliff by 9,500. And looking at the AFRs down there at the bottom, it is lean as hell until about 6,000 RPMs, and even leans out at the top where they're just shutting down the throttle-by-wire system. Makes about 77 horsepower and 50 foot-pounds of torque, and honestly that graph kind of just looks like crap. But with our custom ECU mapping, even for the bone stock exhaust system, we've completely transformed the performance of the bike. You pick up almost 20% more power and torque right there off the bottom, and the top end gains look ridiculous because now the throttle-by-wire stays open, and the fueling's been properly adjusted so it's no longer the lean nonsense that the bike comes with from the factory. And as promised in that video, immediately after we posted it, we went ahead and installed the Acura slip-on, and here's the results for that system. With proper tuning for the slip-on, the power came up to about 84.5 horsepower and 52 pound-feet of torque to the tire, again, just on pump gas. And while that is an improvement, it's not a huge improvement over the stock system. In fact, if I overlay and compare the two for you there, you can see that, yeah, it's about 3 horsepower out there at the very top end of the RPM range, and like 1 foot-pound of torque, 1.5, maybe 2, right there through the mid-range, but it's not going to change your life. It certainly sounds a hell of a lot better, but the performance improvements aren't huge. Now, we also had an Acura header already lined up for this bike, so once we built the slip-on mapping, we went ahead and also installed that and developed our custom ECU mapping for the full system. And just a quick side note, the installation of the full system on this bike is actually really straightforward. It does not get a lot easier than putting a full system on a motorcycle when it comes to these Transalps. You need to pull the radiator to get to the header hardware, so if you're going to think about doing this and you're worried about installation time, don't. This is as simple as an exhaust installation gets on any modern motorcycle. And there's our end result with the full Acura installed and our custom ECU mapping updated for the new airflow of the aftermarket exhaust. Almost 87 horsepower and 54 pound-feet of torque to the tire on pump gas. Now, let's take a close look here and compare the system. Again, the full exhaust being run 28 versus the slip-on being run 27. You do actually lose something here with the full system right between 4,000 and 5,000 RPMs. There's just less pressure there in the exhaust system, so it builds the torque just a little bit later, but after about 5,500 RPMs, the full system clearly outperforms the slip-on. In fact, if I zoom in and highlight some of these areas here for you, you can see that you're picking up 3 horsepower and about 2 foot-pounds of torque pretty much everywhere after about 6,000 RPMs. Those gains carry all the way to the top of the RPM range, and the bike does sound quite a bit better once the catalytic converter and the stock header is out of the equation. Now for most folks, that was probably way too much information way too fast. So let's back up here really quick, remove pretty much everything else between how the bike was from the showroom floor, so probably how you have it right now, and how it is now, with a proper exhaust system and custom tuning in place to match. It doesn't even look like the same bike. You're picking up 9 horsepower peak to peak, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Because out here at 9,500 RPMs, if I zoom in and highlight that area there, you've gained almost 16 horsepower. Right off the bottom, you've gained 8 pound-feet of torque and another 6 horsepower. And those gains just carry pretty much throughout the entire portion of the rev range. And as I said in our previous YouTube video, this doesn't really tell the whole story. Yes, the performance improvements are huge looking at the dyno graph. Even from the seat of your pants, when you hit full throttle, it doesn't even feel like the same motorcycle anymore. But you don't spend most of your time riding these bikes at full throttle, which is why I spent the last several days, in addition to building the custom fuel mapping that we needed to for the slip-on and the full system, developing all the different power modes and the throttle-by-wire mapping. Because again, as I alluded to in that last video, the stock throttle-by-wire mapping in this bike is absolute dog shit. In fact, this quick dyno graph here shows 3 full throttle runs in 3 different power modes, and they aren't even hardly any different at all. The difference between power mode 1, 2, and 3, or sorry, 2, 3, and 4, 4 being sport and then standard, then the one below that, weren't really any different at full throttle. In fact, they were within like a horsepower of each other because the throttle-by-wire mapping at full throttle was almost identical. So you have all these different rider modes on the bike, but they don't really feel like distinct modes from the factory. So I completely threw out the stock throttle-by-wire mapping and developed our own. Sport mode now feels like a true sport mode. It is a much more linear throttle response. The power comes on much smoother and stronger than it ever did from the factory in sport mode. And in standard mode, it's a little bit more aggressive, but not much, because you still want a commuter mode on this thing, or if you're hitting some uneven roads, you still want to be able to go over them smoothly without having the throttle jerk on you and end up kind of going back and forth in the saddle. So that mode has also been smoothed out and optimized, and again, unrestricted at the bottom and at full throttle. And then even in the lower power modes like 2 and 1, which are used in like the rain mode and the gravel mode, those are now significantly softened. So you actually have 4 distinct ride modes that you can then select and pick from when you're actually on the bike, depending upon how you want the throttle to respond. And with the appropriate fuel mapping in place now for the stock exhaust system, the slip-on, and the full system, it all feels massively smoother than it ever did from the factory. Again, this is the way it should have come if motorcycle manufacturers weren't hamstrung by emissions compliance. Now, we've had dozens of you reach out to us, which is great. Glad to know that we got a bike that folks want mapping for badly. That's, again, kind of why we're here. And those 2 questions are pretty straightforward. Question 1, and it's the one I kind of expected the most, honestly, is what about octane? What have you done to the ignition timing? Can I still run an 87 in this thing? Do I have to run premium? 99% of the time, when I'm developing mapping here at Two Wheel Dyno Works on our dyno, I'm developing it for premium pump gas, because oftentimes there are significant improvements to be made by advancing the ignition timing in some areas, retarding it in others, and for the additional ignition advance, you do need higher octane fuel. However, on this bike, it didn't really make much more power when I advanced the ignition timing a little bit. Made like 1 or 2 more ponies at the very top end, but it wasn't worth having to run a premium fuel. So, on this very rare occasion, I can accurately answer you and tell you that you can just run pump gas. 87, you don't need higher octane stuff, just whatever it calls for from the owner's manual, which again, I'm 99% certain is 87 octane, you'll be completely fine. And the second question that everybody asked us is, how can we buy the ECU Flash? Why isn't it on your website? When are you adding support? Just pause. If there was not 1 or 2 lingering issues in the back end of the software that I'm not even really going to go into because they're honestly irrelevant. They won't be there by the time that we add support for it on the website, so it's not worth talking about. I would have already done it because, again, the whole goal of us buying these bikes and offering tuning for them is obviously to make a living. So if it was possible to provide you guys with a completely 100% dialed in perfect flash this very second, it would already be up on our website and available for $349.99. I'm guessing the software developers probably need 3 or 4 more days to smooth out the last weird little idiosyncrasies and kind of quirks that we've found in the software when we manipulate some of these maps, and then we'll be good to go. So just sit tight, hang on. It will be available, I'm hoping, sometime next week, and as soon as it is, I'll post another much more in-depth video breaking down all the different maps that we modify in the different rider modes, what we've done with the fueling values for the stock exhaust, the slip-on, and the full system, because obviously with the full system there's quite a bit more fuel necessary than the stock exhaust ever needed, and I'll do a much more thorough breakdown of everything when we announce that it's finally released. So again, just sit tight, appreciate the patience, but I guarantee it's absolutely worth the wait, because for $350, this is by far the most transformative thing you will ever do to your Honda Transalp. And I can make that guarantee because, again, I own this thing, and I've ridden it substantially. I've also ridden the Tenere 700 more times than I can count. We've flashed literally thousands of those Yamaha CP2 engine-powered bikes and the ECUs that essentially control them. And I can tell you from experience that the reviews out there comparing the Tenere 700 to the Transalp are wrong. None of the people reviewing or comparing the 2 bikes have ever actually owned or rode them in an equal form. And I'm talking about a Tenere 700 with a aftermarket intake, usually a snorkel delete in those things, a full exhaust, and proper ECU mapping. Yeah, they make like 67, 68 horsepower to the tire on pump gas. Cool, great. It's also a big improvement over stock. But this thing, with, again, a full exhaust and proper tuning installed, haven't even played with the intake yet, blows it completely out of the water. That is a perfectly tuned Tenere 700. Again, common snorkel delete, full exhaust, ECU mapping, perfectly dialed in. Compared to this Transalp, it's not even in the same ballpark of performance. At the very top end, you are talking about a difference of over 21 horsepower and 11 pound-feet of torque. I mean, again, not even in the same league compared to one another. Yeah, sure, the Tenere has like this much more suspension travel and comes with a skid plate. Who gives a shit? This has a lower seat height, a skid plate's like $300, and well, let's face it, nobody's really using these things unless you are a serious hard enduro guy to their complete extent when it comes to suspension travel anyway. So on paper, is the Tenere like this much better off-road? Yeah, sure. But who gives a crap? You don't spend more than 50% of your time off-road. You spend the majority of it on-road, and then you go onto like some fire roads or something like that. Very few people are actually doing single track on these things. And again, the performance is just night and day. A properly tuned Tenere 700 compared to a properly tuned Transalp is no comparison whatsoever. 20 horsepower difference is fucking huge. And nobody's really talking about that because, again, nobody else has actually ridden the two in a comparable, properly uncorked and tuned form, probably besides us. Honestly, I could rant on and on and on about how much better of a bike this is than the Tenere 700, but I just don't have the time. So, please just have a little bit more patience. Our ECU flashing will be available for these bikes on our site soon. We are also next going to start testing some intake modifications. I have a K&N air filter we're going to drop in this thing, see if it makes any difference whatsoever. I have a feeling it won't, but I'll cover that in the next video, and hopefully when we release the ECU mapping on our website for these bikes. And as always, if you have any questions whatsoever about your Transalp or modifications to it, or getting it properly tuned and dialed in, don't hesitate to email us at support@209works.com, because we are always happy to help.